Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from Miami, USA, Mr. Christian Boucousis. Boo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited for our conversation today.
Thank you. Boo is the Chief Executive Officer of Afterburner, Inc., and it's an unusual name, but we'll get to know very quickly why. He's a former fighter pilot turned business founder, author, and speaker, and his latest keynote is Human 2.0, The Evolution of Thinking, and we'll speak about that as well. So, Boo, before we talk about Afterburner, tell me a little bit about your own amazing journey.
Yeah, life's funny, I suppose. I've always been driven by doing things that mean something, I think. And when I was 5 is when I first connected with my desire to be a fighter pilot. And what I say, the day I knew I was going to become a fighter pilot was that when I was at that very first air show and watching the jets fly over, and had this very visceral experience with all the noise, the speed, the smells of the jet fuel, just the visual effect of looking at all these fighter pilots in their green suits and patches. And this was in the early to mid 80s when I was that little. And from that moment on, I didn't really have any other career aspiration or dream apart from being a fighter pilot. And I was lucky when I was 21, I started flying fighter jets, specifically an aircraft called the F-18 Hornet in the Royal Australian Air Force. And that career spanned 11 years. And unfortunately, like many people, I suppose, that have diverse stories, I was medically discharged. I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease unexpectedly, which was a very painful condition for flying, and moved into business. I didn't want to be an airline pilot. I felt like I needed to contribute to the rebuilding of Afghanistan and Iraq at the time, and started a humanitarian projects company, which effectively did all the projects that no one else did. And one of the original elements of our business was helping repatriate people that had been killed into Nepal and India. So we did did a lot of work with the Indian government. We had an office in New Delhi. Okay. We had a lot of people from all over the world: Philippines, London, Paris, New York, Geneva. Did a lot of, and we worked mostly with the United Nations, the United Nation project officers, as well as the directly with the donors who were looking to place money but lost trust in the ability for those funds to be utilized effectively. So that business was a resounding success. It grew rapidly, like for a young 30-year-old. I still felt like a kid when it came to business. My business partner and I, we just kind of lost control of that a little bit as we grew up towards 6,000 people and a whole bunch of payroll issues and all the rest. So we sold that business to a multinational. I came back to Australia via Papua New Guinea and then moved into construction. And why construction? Because we were trying to figure out ways to build big structures in the emerging markets where a lot of volatility existed in the materials and labor costs of buildings. And we started this in Papua New Guinea, which was experiencing a big oil and gas boom. And we came up with this concept called volumetric prefabricated modular construction, which is just big Lego blocks. Basically, you build an entire building in a factory, and you put it together on site with all the rooms and everything finished. And that way, sort of control the environment. It didn't work in Papua New Guinea for various reasons. That's a whole podcast in itself. But we did end up building that structure in a city in Australia, and it was set a record for a 17-story high-rise tower, 120-room hotel. Got involved in publishing, reconnected with my aviation roots and love of aviation when I bought the biggest aviation magazine in the Southern Hemisphere and converted that into a digital publishing platform. And around 10 years ago, came across this company called Afterburner. And it was the first time really I sat down in a room, and Afterburner delivers keynotes and workshops and presentations to enterprises to help them with their human and organizational performance. And I sat there and I watched a fighter pilot delivering a keynote for Australia's largest insurance company at the time. And as he unfolded the fighter pilot, the way that we work and the things that we do, I just had this epiphany, and I realized that all of this value I never really had awareness of about how I think and how I do things each and every day was codified by this company called Afterburner. So I started a journey there, and I bought the local license for Australia and Asia, and then this year I bought the whole company. Because I believe in this message, and along the way there, I connected with this evolution of thinking, where I believe as humans we are still analog in the way that we approach thinking and putting our thoughts into action, whereas fighter pilots have a digital way of thinking. It's far quicker, it's more adaptive. And at the moment, that's my journey, is to a little bit like you with this podcast. For me, it's about having this way of thinking delivered to as broad a church as possible, because I fundamentally believe if you think this way, your life dreams are easier to achieve, your business dreams are easier to achieve, and everything becomes faster. And if I look on my life and what I've managed to fit in it, and I'm just shy of 50 now, I feel like I've fit 4 times more than the average person in those years. And there's an amazing study that was done a few years ago of 638,000 high performers, and in that study it said that on average, people who have a different way of approaching, I don't like the word high performance, I don't agree with it. I think it's a bad way to describe consistent success. But in this study, the researchers identified that these people who fill their lives can achieve 400% more than the average person. And I think that's amazing. I mean, we can't create time, can we? Well, we all live with the same amount of hours in a day, but if you can put 4 times more into it, then that by definition is a fuller life.
Well said. And given the fact that you yourself were a fighter pilot, and you had this realization listening to a fighter pilot, how do you believe the discipline of a fighter pilot can be translated into the corporate world?
It's another word that sits uncomfortably with me, because I am not a disciplined person, but I was equipped with a habit forming system. So the way that fighter pilots think is very habit forming. And one of the challenges when we look at literature around the most effective habits of high performers, or atomic habits, or habits this, habits that, the reality is for a lot of us, our habits are different. And what we need within the bodies that we have, the physicality that we have, whether we're night owls or early birds, is often these prescribed habits don't work for everyone, and therefore we give up. Whereas the fighter pilot way of creating habits is very much around the habits that are relevant to what you need to achieve in your life, because it's an iterative cognitive model. So it's constantly evolving your actions each day, and I call it the feel, think, do loop. It purposefully and intentionally links how you feel to what you think to what you do, and it does that by incorporating a feedback loop. And that means that every day or when you have an emotional response, or you're at the end of the day, you have to stop and connect through a simple conversation, which is, what did I try to achieve today? What actually happened? Why was there a gap between my intentions and actions? And what can I do about it now or first thing in the morning? And that might be one thing. It might be 2, or it might be 3. Now, if you're a problem solver or entrepreneur, to some degree, you're equipped with this way of thinking anyway, because you have to survive. And fighter pilots is a high consequence environment. Not just in combat, the machines themselves can bite you, and it's you're in the air. So if you make a mistake, you'll hit the ground. You can't just stop and think, or it's a zero-sum game. Like it's the net effect of bad performance is hitting the ground. Correct. And no other business really has that, right? You might go out of business or into liquidation or put into administration, or bankruptcy, but you're still going to be around. So I think when you have that consequence, that's really galvanizing. And for me now, the journey is, why is this such an effective way of thinking using contemporary contemporary research, whereas in the Air Force, we just did it because we had to survive. And the rates of accidents and deaths and our success in combat, when we started to think this way 60 years ago, it was an exponential increase in performance and decrease in fatalities. And there is no other performance model that delivered that significant an impact with a tweak of the way we think. And Afterburner, we call it the plan, brief, execute, debrief cycle. That's it. 4 steps.
Yeah.
So conceptually very simple, but in practice quite complicated because it's all about you and how honest we are with ourselves, and how we create peer groups around us that also drive that accountability, but create a desire to be accountable, the want to enjoy the responsibility of accountability.
Great response. And, when I was preparing to have my conversation with you and reading about you, I also came across this interesting OODA, the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. Tell me a little bit more about these 4 words and how can businesses implement these in their strategies?
So the OODA loop is the origins of this digital thinking. It's the origins of decision making. As you and I sit here talking to each other, we are the sum product of every single decision that we've made in our life. Okay, that's the one thing all humanity has in common. Every single thing we do is a choice. The environment might push us into uncomfortable situations. The environment may ask us to make compromises, both morally and ethically. But it's still ultimately your decision as to which pathway you take, right? So the OODA loop is designed to allow humans to make the best decisions possible. When I learned the OODA loop, I didn't really understand it. That was a challenge for me. I knew what the words were trying to say, but to try and get my head around it was quite difficult. So if you look at the 4 simple steps, observe really just means before you make a decision, observe the environment around you, right? Once you understand what's going on, then orientate yourself, put yourself in a position of advantage relative to the environment. At that position of advantage, you've got to put a check in place and say, did I actually create the advantage I was expecting or not? And then you make a decision, and the decision can be no. I'm going to go back and observe again for a little bit. But if we make the decision, then we have to act immediately. And through that action, we create impact. And it's the impact that we then observe again. And so the loop continues. I went on a journey to codify that in a bit more detail. And there's 7 steps that humans follow every time they make a decision. The first is they perceive the environment around them. And that's important because most of our decisions are based on perception, not reality. From our perceptions, we start our thoughts. Our thoughts are projected into the future. So what we perceive is going to happen. We make the decision based on the future, not actually what's happening now. Those decisions, the actions equal results. The results equal an impact, and the impact feed back into our perceptions. So if we make decisions around certain things in life, and we have a negative experience, we tend to have continual negative experiences with that until we perceive something outside of our control changed it. And luck is a perception, right? And once we understand that we're principally driven by neuroscience, identifies 95% of our decisions roughly are made with our subconscious, right, as the driver. So once we understand that, and that we're fundamentally driven by our autopilot, our behaviors and our biases, we immediately can adjust them. And the problem with the world right now is the way information is fed to us. It actually feeds our biases. We have platforms that run algorithms to feed us what we want to see, not what we need to see. So this is an enormous challenge for us in terms of breaking that cycle. And I think the one thing that fighter pilots do culturally that is different to any organization, and I've worked with hundreds of organizations. Afterburner's worked with 3,500 organizations, over 2 million people. And in those 25 years, we have never worked with an organization that has debrief culture as a culture to drive performance and a culture to drive psychological safety. And there's two ways you measure an organization that has debrief culture. The first is embracing radical accountability, or what we call nameless and rankless. So we have conversations where the hierarchy is put to the side, and we're purely focused on results and objective outcomes. And the second is the methodology that we use, which is based on feeding forward lessons and actions rather than feedback. And that's that 4-step process I said before. What was my objective? What was my result?
Yeah.
Why is there a gap between the two? And what's my action right now? And we call that ORCA, the killer whale. Objective, result, cause, and action. And from our organ, some of the biggest companies in the world use this Afterburner methodology. You might be familiar with brands such as Pfizer, Nike, NFL. They have indoctrinated and codified their own version of flawless execution, because we have worked with some of these companies for many, many years.
Well said. So, Boo, I'm now going to move to the human 2.0, the evolution of thinking. What defines a human 2.0, and what sets them apart from the way we've traditionally understood human capabilities?
There was an interesting study that came out of the US back in 2016, and they sat people in a white room in a white chair between the ages of 19 and 88. And when they sat the people in the white room with the white chair, all they asked was them to rate that performance as to whether they enjoyed it or not. And by and large, people did not enjoy being in a white room on a white chair, left alone with their thoughts. So they adjusted the study and they said, why don't you go and do that at home? So they got them to do replicate the same experiment, but sitting at home. So they were surprised at this study when it identified that they didn't enjoy the experience anymore. But when they introduced a distraction, such as the TV, a large number of the folks on the study admitted to cheating and turning on the TV. So the fact that people started cheating took the study in another direction, and they came back to the university. They put everyone back in the white room, but this time they put a battery with an electric shock on everyone's ankle. And when the people were sitting in the room, over 60% of them gave themselves an electric shock. So one of the deductions that came from the study was people would prefer to do something that inflicted pain or was a negative action rather than sit quietly and collect their thoughts. So the evolution of thinking is taking a human from someone who's biased purely towards action and doing things into an integrated way of thinking, which intentionally connects feelings, thoughts, and actions. If you look back at fighter pilots always operated as two airplanes, the wingman and the lead, for a very important reason, because as a human, we always think in terms of multitask, right? So that's doing two things at once.
Right.
But what we rarely talk about is multi-thinking, which is thinking and doing at the same time, which are two completely different parts of the brain, okay? So when you have a wingman and a lead, what you actually have is you have one pilot busy flying the mission and looking at all the systems and trying to find the bad guys, and the other pilot thinking. And we effectively create two brains. This kind of goes into the triune brain theory, unconscious, subconscious, conscious, that the brain has these that operates with these three states simultaneously. And fighter pilots have unlocked that latent subconscious capability through habits, repetition, standardization. So if you program those biases and you program the autopilot, your cognitive mind gets better and faster. So the fundamental difference with the evolution of thinking is to understand the integrated nature of the brain, that our feelings are our perceptions. So that's the first part of the decision-making tree. So if they're not real, they're a perception of the world. Our thoughts transition feelings into action. So the more negative our feelings, the more negative our thoughts, the more negative our actions are, which is, and we see that manifested in behavior around the world. People who are behaving badly, but ultimately they're not bad people. but also breaking the loop and breaking the loop from doing the wrong things or doing things that create a negative feeling. And it's that fourth step, the proactive application of a debrief, where if the principal trigger for it is really how you feel. So if you're not feeling good, you want to create this debrief. And if you look at it from a clinical psych perspective, it has similarities to the cognitive behavior therapy that psychologists use for people that suffer anxiety and depression, or bringing rational thought to emotional feelings and thoughts.
Sure, well said. And do you think there are limits to how much humans can evolve their thinking?
Well, I don't like to look at the world as having any limits, really. And again, I was researching human evolution, and as humans, we're evolving 100 times faster than we were 100 years ago. So clearly, technology evolves exponentially, right? And given how integrated we are with technology, I guess the question is technology going to also drive our evolution more quickly?
Yep, that was going to be my next question, but why don't you answer that as well? Okay.
I think that when it comes to evolution of thinking, I think there's a quick win. I genuinely believe there's a quick win, right? If you talk growth mindset, fixed mindset, how does someone who has a fixed mindset artificially create growth? Well, debrief. Because through a debrief, you have to grow, because you are connecting what you want, which is tomorrow, to what happened, which is today, to what you did yesterday in one conversation. And we don't do that very well as people. We don't do those three phases of time in conversations very well. So when you purposely connect those three states of time, and then you create an action, so you project your action you do an action that projects you into the future, the byproduct of that is growth. Okay, growth as a person, growth as a business, and that is the key evolution. You evolve from having beliefs and structures that are limiting into growth structures and into growth as a person. It also helps you with awareness. Okay, so one of the on my own podcast, constantly talking to people about stress and about what people do to become effective, and they constantly talk about this concept called awareness. But as fighter pilots, we call it situational awareness, where look, awareness is great, but again, awareness of yourself is driven by your biases and driven by all this stuff that we can't control. Whereas if you start to put awareness in the context of a situation, you now have context. So if you're in a situation which should be positive, you're at a music concert, for example, and you're not enjoying it, then that should create awareness that there's something, you might feel depressed, you might have some sort of sensitivity to music, but by and large, people will just feel miserable somewhere that they should feel good and then leave. Equally, if you feel stuck, confused, and frustrated, that's all a feeling. There's 34,000 combinations of feelings. So no wonder humans are hard work, right? So anytime we have these feelings, if we just kick in these thought loops, these debriefs, it enables us to break the cycle. So to me, if evolution is constantly seeking and adapting into a better version or a version that is more suitable to the environment, therefore evolution requires a situation in which to evolve in. So if you artificially create that through this conversation and create situational awareness, the byproduct of it must be some form of evolution in thinking. And we know from neuroscience and neuroplasticity, if you evolve the way you think, your brain does. The neural pathways actually evolve. They are created in a new way to create new habits and new thoughts. So yeah, I think the evolution of thinking and the evolution of the way you think is the quick win. Whether you can evolve into a superhuman athlete, well, look, that's another. That's not my field of expertise.
No, well said. And my last question to you, Boo, and this is for the many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey and such a varied number of experiences, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want a lot of our viewers and listeners to take away?
Well, one of them is just do three things. So the rule of threes, I'm a big believer in, and that's a core philosophy for fighter pilots. We only ever do three things in a mission, and there's a lot of research around the brain patterns and why three is good. Look, I can sit here and say to people, you need to have a sense of purpose and something you really believe in. I never had to seek that out. I was very fortunate to be gifted with it. But I will tell you, having that as a gift is very powerful for what you do each and every day. When every moment you wake up and your life is to be a fighter pilot, you create a network, what I call the belief network, where all your friends' parents as a kid, everyone knows that when they come into contact with something aviation related, I would always get a phone call or an introduction because everyone knew that Christian was the kid that wanted to be a fighter pilot. The same with your business, the same with your life dream. If you want to be a decathlete and it's in everything that you do, then you will find all the right pieces of information, and your belief network you'll get all of this additional firepower for nothing. So lean into what you believe is true. Performance is what you believe, not what you do. And then finally, it's just never give up. Never quit on it. People often wonder, like, was the day that you quit the day before it happened? So for me, I've always been very doggedly committed, and my whole life has been full of self-doubt and feeling like a fraud and never feeling good enough. It's always been a struggle for me. So the only way I could survive all of those kind of feelings that we all have was just to push through and just, despite all that, just keep going.
Great response. And Christian and Boo, on that note, and your three wonderful lessons, you must have a sense of purpose. Second, you said was believe in what you're doing. And the third you said was never give up. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. Thank you for speaking to me about from an F-18 pilot to a businessman to doing so many different things that you spoke about. Thank you for talking to me about ORCA and UDA. Both of them were such amazing acronyms. And I'm sure as viewers and listeners listen to both ORCA and UDA and your explanations that you gave, they will learn many, many new things. Thank you also for speaking to me about Human 2.0 and the evolution of thinking. Thank you again and good luck.
Thank you, Ashutosh. It was a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.